Hello and welcome to the Final Fantasy XIV General Tanking Guide. My name is Julia and in this video we will be talking about the ins and outs of tanking in Final Fantasy XIV. After making guides on each specific tank, I realized that learning how to play certain jobs is not enough to be a competent tank. With that in mind, I decided to make this video to teach you the fundamentals of tanking itself. Combine this video with one of the job guides linked in the description and you'll become a formidable tank. Before diving in, I'd like to cover some terms commonly used while talking to other tanks. These terms will also frequently be used in any guides. Enmity is the aggression system in the game. The term enmity is interchangeable with terms like aggro or threat from other MMORPGs and dictates who the boss is attacking. Mitigation is anything that reduces incoming damage by either applying barriers to players or straight up lowering it by a certain percentage. Kitchen Sink refers to a scenario where you use all of your available mitigation abilities to mitigate incoming damage. Tank busters are actions bosses use meant for tanks that deal high damage to a single or two targets. These usually target the highest enmity or highest two enmities, and sometimes they are in a form of tethers or towers you have to move to intercept. Evoking or provoking refers to using the provoke action to instantly generate a large sum of enmity. Tank swaps refer to changing the target's main enmity between the two tanks, so the other tank becomes the new main target. Tank stance is an ability that each tank has which greatly increases the enmity you generate with all actions. A tank in Final Fantasy XIV is akin to tanks in most MMORPGs. Your job is to divert the boss's attention away from the party, soaking up hard-hitting auto attacks and lethal tank buster mechanics, which only you, a tank, can survive with your increased toolkit. Alongside this, you are tasked with positioning bosses in raids, allowing for better uptime for your DPS players and easier time hitting positional abilities for your melee DPS players. Tanking is something you do alone in a party of 4 or with another person in a party of 8. The exception being alliance raids, where there is one tank per party of 8, but there are 3 parties. Most people think of these two tanks as main tank and off tank. However, the idea of main tank and off tank is a little dated. These days, both tanks should be looked at as a singular entity that is dealing with enmity and tank busters together. This is because the main enmity might be swapped around throughout a boss fight to share single target tank busters, or because the tanks might have to team up to share a single tank buster. Many tank busters also target the 2 highest enmities or just the 2 tanks. The latter is more common in normal, but not in extreme or savage content. The first tank usually pulls the boss and takes the first tank buster if the fight is designed in such a way, with the second tank swapping in after the buster if applicable in the encounter. Depending on the region you're playing in, many party finder groups use macros to determine strats. In these macros, the tank spots are usually marked as MT and OT. With what we just said in mind, MT or main tank stands for the tank that currently is aggro of the boss. This means that depending on if you have aggro or not, you will have to stand in a different position to resolve a mechanic. This flexibility in dealing with mechanic decreases the amount of spinning the boss does and makes hitting positional attacks for your melee DPS easier, thus increasing the total DPS your raid does. It is worth noting that not everyone does it this way. Some people prefer to have the tanks always go to the same spot, regardless if they have aggro or not. Make sure to agree with your co-tank on whether or not you are swapping positions based on aggro. Every action you use grants you enmity based on the damage or healing done. Enabling your tank stance will increase this enmity tenfold. This is the main way tanks keep aggro of their target. Provoke is an ability all tanks have and works in a very particular way. After using it, it instantly sets your enmity to be equal to the highest current enmity plus a fixed amount. Having your tank stance enabled while using Provoke, this fixed amount is also increased tenfold, causing it to be a significant amount of enmity. Shirk is a targeted ability that donates a quarter of all your enmity to whoever you target. This affects all enemies currently engaged. Targeting an ally can be annoying to do for tanks, especially during tense combat situations. This is why most tanks utilize a Shirk macro to do this instead. The macro cannot be action queued, so you might have to spam press it for the macro to activate. Tank swapping, the act of changing the current main enmity of a target, is done in a very particular way because of the way Provoke works. The full order of how to tank swap is as follows. At first, the boss starts casting an ability on Tank A. Tank B then provokes with their tank stance on. Tank A then uses Shirk or turns off their tank stance. The boss cast will now finish and hit Tank A, and the boss will then continue to target Tank B for the next ability or auto attack. When doing a tank swap, it is key that Tank B provokes before Tank A shirks. It is also paramount that Tank B has their tank stance enabled when they use the provoke ability to increase the amount of enmity generated. Tank A can also turn off their tank stance ahead of time, assuming their enmity lead is significant enough. To mitigate the damage done by tank busters, you will have to use your damage reducing cooldowns. Typically, for tank busters you want to use one or both of your 90-second cooldowns, or the 120-second cooldown 30% damage mitigation. In addition to one of these bigger cooldowns, you want to use a smaller cooldown as well, such as Sheltron, Blood Wedding, the Blackest Night, or Heart of Corundum. Tank busters aren't always mitigated using the same cooldowns because not all tank busters deal the same amount of damage. Your goal is to reduce the amount of resources a healer has to use to keep you alive afterwards. For example, if you swap the main enmity during a tank buster, this would mean you won't take any damage after the tank buster. So if you live with just your big cooldown, whether that is 1000 HP or 100,000 HP, then you can save your short cooldown and give it to your co-tank to help them mitigate auto attacks or any next tank buster. As a tank, you should be flexible enough to change your mitigation usage based on what a fight requires from you. This is a decently difficult skill to obtain, but with practice you will learn this quickly. You can also always ask for help with your cooldown usage in the job-specific balance channels. Alongside these damage mitigating abilities, each tank has access to an invulnerability action. The main idea behind this action is that they make it so most damage is unable to kill you. These invulns are insanely powerful and should be used often. The main moments when it would be good to utilize your invulnerability is in the following scenarios. Stack busters. These are tank busters that require you to stack up with your co-tank. Using an invulnerability, you typically are able to take these alone. Swap busters. Many tank busters apply a vulnerability to the tank hit. This greatly increases the damage dealt to this tank. The usual way to deal with this is to swap enmity by utilizing a tank swap. However, with your invulnerability, you are typically able to take any subsequent auto attacks without any concern. Tank busters where you have few cooldowns available. This naturally makes it easier for you to survive a tank buster and allows you to build up your cooldowns for any future busters. Each tank invulnerability works slightly differently, and it's good for you and your healers to keep this in mind. A paladin's invuln is called Hallowed Ground, and it works like so. You don't take any damage at all, but it does need to be up before the damage snapshots. If it's used after the damage snapshots, the damage will still go through and it can still kill you. The damage usually snapshots at the end of a cast bar, so Hallowed Ground has to be active before the cast finishes. Warrior's invulnerability is called Holmgang, which prevents the warrior from going below 1 HP. This also means that they either need to save self-healing or be healed afterwards they take the buster to survive the first hit after the Holmgang buff falls off. A reminder that they can still take damage during the buff, so heal them up after they take all the damage or just before the invulnerability falls off. Gunbreaker has Super Bolide, which sets the Gunbreaker to 1 HP but then makes them fully immune to damage, allowing them to be healed anytime within the 10 seconds. Dark Knight's invulnerability is Living Dead. After activating it, when the Dark Knight's HP is reduced to 1 HP, during the duration they become immune to death like Holmgang for 10 seconds. If they do not get a total healing amount equal to their maximum HP during this duration, they will die. When it does activate, they get a powerful healing effect on GCDs that helps them heal. Due to how the healing from this works, if you're in a single target scenario, it is worthwhile for your healers to give you roughly 20% of your maximum HP in heals anyway, and in AoE scenarios you should be able to heal up fully on your own. Each tank has a few party utility actions in their kit. The one all tanks have is called Reprisal. This applies a debuff to all nearby enemies, reducing their damage dealt by 10%. Most newer tanks assume this to be a mitigation actions for tank busters, like any of their other defensive actions. However, this ability should first and foremost be used to mitigate rate wights and mechanics. How to use this exactly will be covered later in the guide. Alongside Reprisal, each tank has a 90-second rate wight mitigation option, and these are slightly different for each of them. Paladin gains Divine Veil, which creates a barrier around all party members equal to 10% of the Paladin's maximum HP. It also moderately heals all affected players. Paladin is then also the only tank that has another 2-minute rate wight mitigation called Passage of Arms. This ability channels a zone behind the Paladin in which all party members take 15% reduced damage. You are able to flash this ability to grant this effect to all party members standing within the zone for 5 seconds without interrupting your uptime. Do keep in mind that people have to stand in your wings to get this damage mitigation. Warriors have access to Shake It Off, which grants a barrier to all nearby party members equaling to 15% of their maximum HP. It then also heals them for a small amount and also applies a regen. This can be comboed with Thrill of Battle, Vengeance, and Bloodmodding to increase the percentage of the barrier by 2% each. However, this does dispel these mitigation buffs, so keep this in mind. Generally, you want to use this action so that the heal tops people up, and then the barrier remains for any incoming rate wight or mechanic. The regen can then act as a heal over time for the next 15 seconds. Gunbreakers can use Heart of Light, which reduces all magic damage taken by 10%. Keep in mind the part about magic damage. This does not work on damage that is physical in nature. Dark Knights have the same ability as Gunbreakers, but it's called Dark Missionary instead. Do also keep in mind that this damage reduction only works for magical damage. These actions are very powerful and should be used often to help mitigating mechanics and rate wights. The very nice thing about them is that this can be used without a target, unlike Addle, Feint and Reprisal, which do allow you to mitigate damage, but only when you have a target, so not during intermissions or trio mechanics. Lastly, each tank has a short cooldown, which they can use on themselves, but also grant to other players. These short cooldowns typically are used on your co-tank whenever they take a tank buster, but can also be used on other party members who are squishy and might need some extra love for hard-hitting rate wights, or to help them get back up to health while recovering from mistakes. Paladin has Intervention, which reduces a target's damage taken by 10%. It can combo to 20% if you have Rampart or Sentinel activated when the ability is used. It additionally reduces the damage taken by another 10% for 4 seconds, and lastly applies a heal over time to the target for 12 seconds. Paladins also have Clemency, which is a powerful heal with a large mana cost. If used on another party member, it also heals the Paladin for 50% of their health restored. Warriors have Nascent Flash, which heals the target and the warrior for a moderate amount each time the warrior uses a weapon skill. It also grants a 10% reduction in damage to the target for 8 seconds, alongside with another 10% reduction in damage for 4 seconds. Lastly, it also grants the target a moderate barrier. Dark Knights have the Blackest Night, which applies a barrier to the target equal to 25% of the target's maximum HP. The barrier has a short 7-second duration, so don't use it too early or it might fall off. It also has a 15-second cooldown, which is notably shorter than any other tank's short cooldown. They also have Ablation, which they can use to grant themselves or a party member a 10% damage reduction buff. Lastly, Gunbreakers have Heart of Corundum, which reduces the damage taken by a target by 15% for 8 seconds and another 15% for 4 seconds. It then also gives them a buff called Carcasses of Corundum, which gives them a strong heal when their health falls below 50% or when the buff is expired. They also have Aurora, which gives the target a heal over time buff for 18 seconds. Mistakes are bound to happen. Sometimes you or your co-tank dies. When this happens, the tank that's still alive has to ensure that they immediately grab Enmity to become the main target of the boss. Afterwards, you need to plan ahead. If there's a tank buster coming up, you could plan to use your invulnerability on that and shift cooldowns around to deal with subsequent tank busters. If you do not have access to your invulnerability, you can try to live it by using everything available. This will give your healers a little bit more leeway to raise their fallen party members. You can additionally request external mitigation from their healers, as they typically have targeted percentage-based mitigation and GCD barriers available as well. If people are at low health due to mistakes or deaths, just before a mechanic or a raid wipe comes up, you might be inclined to use your short mitigation actions on your party members instead. Usually you want to ensure the survival of your healers first, your race caster second, and anyone else third. Starting an encounter can be done in a few different ways. Deciding on which one you use typically is done by looking at the aggro range of the boss. The most commonly used is the ranged pull. This has you start off by using your ranged ability, which coincidentally has increased enmity generation. This method of pulling the boss is typically used when the boss is far away. The only tank that shouldn't default to ranged pulls are Dark Knights. Ranged pulls aren't bad for them, but it's simply not the best option. Alternatively, you can do a face pull. This method has you run into melee range and hit a melee GCD on the boss. This can lead to some inconsistent pull timings due to the proximity aggro of the boss while you're running in. Typically you start a face pull by running into the boss at around -1 seconds. Usually this method is used when you are able to start the encounter basically in melee range of the boss, or if you're a Dark Knight. If, as Dark Knight, you're uncomfortable doing a face pull, then simply default to doing a ranged pull instead. Lastly, there's a Vogue pull, which is basically the same as doing a face pull, but you use provoke to align with the countdown reaching 0. This causes the pull timing to be a little bit more consistent than face pulling, but you can lose a short moment of the uptime if you are not in melee range when the provoke animation ends. This is a good pulling method to use when you are starting at a medium distance from the boss. This entails that you are able to run to the boss before the proximity aggro snaps onto you. This does delay your first GCD by roughly the time of the animation lock or provoke. Practically, this is around 0.6 seconds. The main thing to coordinate with your tank is your reprisal usage. This is because you cannot use two of them at the same time, as they override each other. The most common way to solve this is to agree that one tank uses their reprisal on the first raid wipe or mechanic, and the second tank uses it on the one afterwards, alternating uses as the fight goes on. Another thing to agree on, which is very important, is which tank has aggro and which tank buster which tank takes. This also includes your invulnerability usage, as this can significantly shift your cooldown usage around. Tanking in dungeons is differently from tanking in raids. First and foremost, ensure that you have your tank stance enabled at all times. There is no reason to not have this enabled in 4-man content. Usually people assume that they have to save their cooldowns for boss encounters, but in dungeons this is not the case. Bosses don't really deal high damage. Even their tank busters can be taken by just having your short mitigation action up if needed. Monsters in between the bosses do deal heaps of damage though. Most tanks opt to do something called a wall-to-wall pull, where they pull all monsters up to a certain point where they cannot run further. This causes there to be a lot of enemies attacking you. However, do not fear. Properly using your cooldowns can make this damage a breeze to deal with. The main thing to take into account is to space your cooldowns out. You always want to have some form of mitigation active. This is mostly done by alternating your big mitigation cooldowns, being Rampart, Arm's Length and your 30% job specific mitigation. On top of that, you want to sprinkle in your shorter cooldowns by using them basically on cooldown to ensure you do not take more damage than healable. Another thing you can do is to aggressively use your invulnerability. Try to maximize the uses of this ability on ad pulls outside of boss fights, as they prevent you from taking damage, period. A wall-to-wall pull is typically done by using sprint first and running into melee range of the first pack of enemies. Try to use your AoE skills to quickly gain aggro on the enemies before running towards the next pack. Repeat this until you're unable to continue to move forwards. Ensure that the enemies are grouped up somewhat neatly in a clump so your DPS players can more easily use their AoE abilities on them. Lastly, it is worth noting that not all healers are confident with wall-to-wall pulls. While some tanks are able to sustain themselves completely without any aid from healers, others do require some minimal help. At lower levels you also have less mitigation options, and thus you will be taking a lot more damage. If your healer is unable to keep you alive, even while you're using your mitigation perfectly, then consider slowing down for their sake. Please subscribe for more Final Fantasy XIV content and guides. A special thanks to all of the theory crafters that helped me fact check and make this video. Their names are on screen now.